And the Great Okeechobee Hurricane, it was what we call a Cape Verde type hurricane. As you can see, it traveled from the west coast of Africa, came straight across the Atlantic, and entered the Leeward Islands, and moved over the Bahamas and into South Florida, over there in the Okeechobee region. And it killed, and there was approximately several hundred persons died in the Caribbean, but it was devastating to the Bahamas as well. But this is one storm that I didn't do much documentation of the effects that it did in the Bahamas, but mostly in South Florida. And it formed September 6, 1928, and dissipated on the 20th of September 1928. It was a Category 5 hurricane. The maximum sustained winds were 160 miles per hour, and in the Bahamas, the official count is 140 miles per hour, but there was gusting to 157 on one of the islands. And the lower central pressure was 929 millibars, and approximately 4,118 persons died in this storm. 3 in the Bahamas, 18 in Turks and Caicos. In fact, the Turks and Caicos Island, 18 persons died, and they died from a schooner. There was a schooner with 23 persons on board. They were not knowing that hurricane was traveling, and they were caught in the storm, and 18 of the 23 persons died in that storm. And in Florida, like I said, at least 2,500, and the damage estimates were approximately $100+ million in 1928 US dollars. It affected the Virgin Islands, the Les Antilles, Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and the eastern seaboard. And you ask why I call Hurricane the Great Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928. It's not a name that I chose. Prior to 1950, they never started naming hurricanes until 1950. From 1950 to 1952, they named the hurricanes after the military alphabet, Able, Baker, Charlie, and so on, or Alpha Brown. They named them after the US military alphabet, and that lasted for 2 years. The problem that they found was that for insurance purposes and for legal references, they found that it would create a problem if more than one, for example, let's say Hurricane Able affected affected some area of the North Atlantic and had to retire. What name would they use? So they started naming them in 1953 after women. And from 1953 to 1978, they were named exclusively after women. I don't know why the men, but what happens is that the women started complaining. They wrote letters, tons of letters to the World Meal Organization. And they complained saying that, hey, if a woman could, why can't they name it after a man? And they were consistent with that. They wrote to the United States government, they wrote to the World Meal Organization, they wrote to the United Nations and complained. And so after many years, in 1979, they listened. So they started naming the hurricane woman name, then a man, then a woman, and so on. So every other name is a woman name. And that is still in use today. And there are other reasons they named prior to 1950. First of all, they named it after the country or city they devastated. And one example of this is the Great Nassau Hurricane of 1926. If you Google that name, the Great Nassau Hurricane, it's known throughout the region and throughout the world as the Great Nassau Hurricane of 1926 because it devastated us here in Nassau, it devastated Nassau, our capital. And it killed 258 persons in the Bahamas with that storm. Many of those were sponge fishermen who went out to sea not knowing a storm was traveling, and they were caught in the storm and they died. So, and after that, the British, the governor at the time wrote to the British government requesting assistance. They sent a British warship from Bermuda, which is where they kept the Caribbean fleet in case there was a hurricane. It was stationed in Bermuda, and they sent it from Bermuda to render assistance to the Bahamas in the 1926 hurricane. They came, and after they left, they were caught in the storm. 88 of I think it's 120 plus persons died in that warship. It's one of the greatest loss for a British warship during peacetime ever. And second, they also named them after the saint of the, and there's other storms named, for example, the great Miami hurricane of 1926. Also, that occurred, the Nassau hurricane occurred in July. The Miami hurricane occurred in September, and it devastated the city of Nassau. And there are other islands throughout the Caribbean that have storms either named after their city or the country. Second, they named them after the saint of the day. This storm was known as Saint Philip Segundo, Spanish for the second. This is Saint Philip the Second. And because another hurricane in the late 1800s was named Saint Philip the First, and they named this storm after Saint Philip Segundo to recognize the difference. They also named the hurricanes after the holiday they struck on. One such storm was the Great Labor Day Hurricane of 1935, which devastated South Florida and killed a lot of the war veterans who came back from the war. And they also named them after ships that encountered the storm, experienced the brunt of the storm, or caused significant death toll in the storm. And one of those examples were the Sea Venture Hurricane of 1609. In 1609, a fleet of ships coming from England to the United States to fortify the Jamestown colony. They came in, they were caught near Bermuda, and the storm, and they basically, if you read my book, the storm, the boat started to leak, and they did things to stop it, like stuffing salt beef into the leak of, the thing of the ship. And they swam, they got into Bermuda, and they named this Bermuda Sumner's Island, and that was named after the captain of the Sea Venture, George Summers. And so they also named them after important persons in the region who experienced the storm. One of them was the Benjamin Franklin Hurricane of 1743. Benjamin Franklin he had his own hurricane, and in 1763 he was doing research on an eclipse, and he basically wanted to study the eclipse that night, but the storm, the cloudiness obscured his view of the sky. And back then they thought that hurricanes were stationary. They didn't know that hurricanes traveled from one place to the next. So he thought that it was just something local over his area. But he did research. He sent requests to different newspapers on the eastern seaboard, and he found that they also experienced the same storm, same weather conditions as well. And then it was the first time that basically they started tracking storms. It's the first incidence of someone tracking a storm. And so they call it Benjamin Franklin Hurricane of 1743, and there's others. There's Alexander Hurricane, and there are other names as well, who also had their names. And like I said, most of the migrant workers came from the Bahamas to work in Florida. There were several reasons why they went there. The first was to find employment working on the vegetable and citrus farms as migrant workers in the Okeechobee region. And what happened in the early 1920s, the U.S. government drained the lake and so that they can expose the muck dirt for agriculture and farming. So they did levees and canals to basically control the water flow. And some of them they also went to work as construction workers on the railroads, which hung Henry flag aboard about. And after the railroad, they stayed there. They stayed there to find work otherwise. And there was also a lack of employment opportunities in the Bahamas, especially on the Family Islands. And also the failure of major industries in the Bahamas, such as cotton, wrecking, and salvaging, turtle exports, pineapples, tomatoes, sisal, and sponging. And if you know your history, you'll find out that just about all of them failed, and they failed for different reasons. And once they failed, those persons need something to find some kind of means of employment. Many of them migrated to South Florida to work, and some worked in the hotels, some worked in the farms. And the impact of the Great Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928 on the Bahamas. This storm caused at least 2,500 deaths in Florida, and like I said, of which approximately 1,400 were Bahamian workers, migrant workers. It caused an additional 1,607 deaths